Two crews, same yard, same locomotive, same 8-hour shift. One finishes with fuel to spare, the other limps back to the rack running on fumes, hoping they make it before the engine quits. This wasn't a matter of one crew working harder than the other. It wasn't about distance covered or tonnage moved. Both crews did essentially the same work, moved similar cuts of cars, and followed the same operating rules. The difference was the locomotive itself, the ALCO C415. On paper, this should have been a straightforward machine to operate. 1,500 horsepower, a proven engine family, a compact frame suited for yard work, everything a railroad needed in a modern switcher. In practice, the C415 turned fuel management into educated guesswork, and that single characteristic, not any mechanical deficiency, not any fundamental design flaw, would ultimately limit this locomotive's place in American railroading. This is the story of a locomotive that worked perfectly well, but couldn't be planned for. And in the railroad business, unpredictability is its own kind of failure. By the early 1960s, the American Locomotive Company was in trouble. Their share of the locomotive market had been shrinking for years, squeezed by Electromotive Division's dominance and their own reputation for building powerful but temperamental machines. ALCO needed products that could compete. Not just in raw performance, they had always been competitive there, but in the practical day-to-day realities of railroad operations. The C415 emerged from this environment in 1966. It was ALCO's attempt at a modern switcher, designed to replace their aging S-Series locomotives that had been workhorses since the 1940s. The specifications looked promising. The locomotive rode on 4 axles in a BB wheel arrangement, delivering 1,500 horsepower from a single ALCO C415 prime mover, an 8-cylinder turbocharged diesel that was part of ALCO's newest and most refined engine family. The frame measured just over 50 feet, short enough for tight yard track work, but long enough to accommodate the larger engine. Visibility was a major selling point. The cab sat high, with a short hood ahead and a longer hood behind, giving crews better sight lines than the older end cab switchers they were replacing. For yard work, where you're constantly watching for ground crews, track obstructions, and the ends of your cuts, visibility matters enormously. ALCO positioned the C415 as a versatile unit. It could handle traditional switching duties, building trains, breaking down arrivals, working industrial spurs, but it also had enough power and road speed for transfer runs between yards and light road assignments where a full road locomotive would be overkill. This versatility was supposed to be an advantage. Railroads could use one locomotive type for multiple duties instead of maintaining separate fleets of pure switchers and light road units. Several railroads took interest. The Longs. Island Railroad became the largest buyer, eventually rostering 11 units for their extensive yard and branch line operations. The Delaware and Hudson purchased 6. A handful went to industrial operators and short lines. In total, ALCO built only 26 units between 1966 and 1968. That number tells you something went wrong. 26 locomotives over 3 years, from a builder desperate for orders, suggests the C415 wasn't meeting expectations. But to understand why, you have to look beyond the sales figures to how this locomotive actually behaved in service. Before we continue, if you think our content is unique and informative, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Also, make sure to share the video with other train fanatics out there. The heart of the C415 was the 251E diesel, and this is where the locomotive's operational quirks began. The 251 engine family was ALCO's response to criticism that their earlier 244 engines were unreliable. The 251 was genuinely good, cleaner, more durable, and easier to maintain than its predecessor. By the mid-1960s, it had proven itself in road service, powering ALCO's Century Series locomotives on freight and passenger runs across the country. But the 251E in the C415 was optimized differently than the engines in pure yard switchers. Consider how a traditional yard switcher operates. It spends enormous amounts of time sitting still, idling, waiting for the ground crew to finish coupling or for a signal to clear. When it does move, it's typically short bursts, a few car lengths here, a quarter mile there. The throttle goes from idle to notch 2 or 3, holds briefly, then drops back to idle. Electromotive switchers, built around their 567 engine series, were specifically tuned for this duty cycle. They burned fuel at predictable, consistent rates. whether they were idling for an hour or working steadily. The engine's fuel consumption curve was flat enough that yardmasters could estimate with reasonable accuracy how much fuel a shift would require. The 251E had a different personality. It was designed to operate efficiently under sustained load, exactly what you want for road service, where a locomotive might hold notch 8 for miles at a stretch. Under those conditions, the 251E was competitive with anything on the market, but in yard service, the 251E's efficiency advantages disappeared. At idle, the engine consumed fuel at rates that varied more than railroad planners expected. During the constant throttle transitions of switching work, idle to notch 3, back to idle, up to notch 5, back down, fuel consumption became unpredictable. This wasn't a defect. The engine worked exactly as designed. The problem was a mismatch between what the engine did best and what yard work demanded. Making matters more complicated, the 251E's response to different operating styles was pronounced. Two engineers running the same locomotive through the same yard could produce remarkably different fuel consumption figures, depending on their throttle habits, their approach to idling, and even how they manage the air brake system. When an engineer used the independent brake heavily, which loads the air compressor, which loads the engine, fuel consumption climbed. When cuts of cars were heavier, requiring more power to start moving, consumption climbed. When the yard had even slight grades, consumption became harder to predict. None of this made the C415 a bad locomotive. It made it a locomotive that didn't fit the operational assumptions railroads had developed over decades of using more conventional switchers. Railroad operations depend on predictability. When a yardmaster assigns a locomotive to a shift, they need to know that locomotive will be available for the full shift. When a dispatcher routes a transfer run, they need confidence the power will complete the trip without running dry. The C415 undermined this confidence in ways that were subtle but consequential. Consider duty cycle variation. In a flat classification yard, where the C415 spent most of its time idling between moves, pushing single cars or shortcuts over a hump, fuel consumption might run 15 to 20 gallons per hour. The same locomotive working an industrial district, switching a steel mill or auto plant with heavy loads, constant movement, and grades to contend with, might burn 40 gallons per hour or more. That's a 2-to-1 variation in fuel consumption for the same locomotive doing the same general category of work. For comparison, EMD switchers of the era typically showed much narrower variation across similar duty cycles. The problem compounded when you factored in crew technique. Some engineers were throttle conscious, using the minimum power needed to get cars moving and letting momentum do the work. Others ran heavier on the throttle, preferring quicker acceleration, even when it wasn't strictly necessary. Some crews had a philosophy of never letting the engine idle cold. They'd keep it in notch 1 or 2 during breaks to maintain engine temperature. Others would drop to idle whenever possible. These weren't violations of operating rules. They were the normal variations you find among any group of experienced railroaders. But on the C415, these variations produced fuel consumption differences that could throw off an entire shift's planning. Weather added another variable. Cold weather idling consumed more fuel. Hot weather running consumed more fuel. Humidity affected combustion efficiency. None of these factors were unique to the C415, but on a locomotive already prone to consumption variation, they made prediction even harder. The comparison problem was real. A yardmaster who'd spent years estimating fuel needs for EMD SW1500s or GP38s would apply the same mental models to the C415 and get unreliable results. The C415 didn't follow the same rules of thumb. Its fuel consumption wasn't higher, it was different in ways. That resisted simple calculation. This created what you might call a planning nightmare. The same assignment given to the same locomotive on successive days with similar workloads could produce fuel consumption figures that varied by 30% or more. That kind of variation makes fuel planning a guess rather than a calculation. The C415's fuel tank held approximately 600 gallons, adequate for a switcher, considerably smaller than a road locomotive's capacity. This size made sense for the intended duty. A switcher working close to fuel racks doesn't need the range of a unit that might run 200 miles between servicing, but a smaller tank leaves less margin for error. When fuel consumption is predictable, 600 gallons is plenty. When consumption varies unpredictably, 600 gallons can become a source of constant anxiety. The fuel gauges of the era compounded the problem. These were analog instruments, float gauges, essentially not that different from what you'd find in an automobile of the period. They showed approximate levels, not precise quantities. In road service, gauge imprecision matters less. The locomotive runs steadily, consumption is predictable, and crews develop a reliable sense of how far they can go on a quarter tank. In switching service, everything conspires against accurate readings. The locomotive constantly accelerates and decelerates, sloshing fuel forward and back in the tank. It tilts slightly as it traverses turnouts and crosses. The gauge needle bounces and wanders. Reading it accurately becomes more art than science. Crews learn to distrust the gauge. A reading showing a quarter tank might mean a quarter tank. It might mean an eighth. It might mean 3/8. There was no way to know without stopping to physically measure the fuel, and there's no time for that in the middle of a switching assignment. This uncertainty created conservative behavior. Crews who couldn't trust their fuel readings erred on the side of caution. They'd head for the fuel rack earlier than strictly necessary, interrupting work to take on fuel they might not need. Yard masters, unable to predict how much fuel a C415 would consume, assigned them conservatively. They'd keep C415s close to fuel racks rather than sending them on transfer runs, where running dry would strand the train. They'd shorten assignments to build in fuel margin. They'd double head with other power on jobs where a single C415 should have sufficed, just to have backup if fuel became an issue. The irony was persistent. The C415 usually had enough fuel. The problem wasn't actual fuel shortage. It was the inability to know whether fuel was adequate. That uncertainty drove operational decisions just as surely as actual deficiency would have. Railroads are practical organizations. When equipment has quirks, they develop workarounds. The C415 accumulated its own set of informal rules and restrictions, none of them officially documented in operating manuals, all of them passed along through yard office conversations and crew room wisdom. The most common restriction was geographic. Railroads kept their C415s close to fuel racks. Assignments that would take the locomotive far from servicing facilities went to other power instead. This limited the C415's utility. That transfer run it was supposedly designed for became a job for other locomotives simply because dispatchers couldn't be confident the C415 would complete it. Backup protocols emerged. Some railroads wouldn't send a C415 on a transfer without a second unit coupled, not for power, but for insurance. If the C415 ran low on fuel, the second unit could complete the move. This tied up two locomotives where one should have handled the job. Fueling frequency increased. Rather than fuel at the end of each shift, the normal practice, C415s often got topped off mid-shift. This interrupted work and added servicing costs, but it provided the margin of safety that, unpredictable, consumption demanded. Some railroads developed specific crew training. Engineers assigned to C415s learned throttle techniques that minimized fuel variation, smoother accelerations, more consistent notch selection, less time at extremes. Whether this actually reduced variation or simply made crews feel more in control is unclear, but the training existed. The Long Island Railroad, operating the largest C415 fleet, became perhaps the most adept at managing these locomotives. Their operations involved many short runs, numerous yard facilities, and the kind of frequent servicing opportunities that suited the C415's limitations. For Lear, the C415 worked reasonably well within these constraints. Other operators found the management burden excessive. The Delaware and Hudson, which had purchased C415s hoping to use them flexibly across their system, discovered that flexibility required more oversight than the locomotives were worth. The units worked, but they demanded attention that other switchers didn't require. 26 locomotives. That's the final count for C415 production. To put that in perspective, EMD built over 1,000 SW1500 switchers during roughly the same period. The market existed. Railroads needed modern switchers. They just didn't need this particular modern switcher. The C415's commercial failure wasn't about reliability. These locomotives ran. They didn't break down at unusual rates. The 251E engine proved durable, and the rest of the locomotive was built to ALCO's typically robust standards. It wasn't about performance. The C415 could move cars. It had adequate power, reasonable speed, and acceptable operating characteristics. The failure was about predictability, or rather, its absence. Railroad operations are built on planning. Crews are assigned based on expected workloads. Fuel is provisioned based on expected consumption. Schedules are built around expected capabilities. The C415 disrupted these expectations. Not dramatically, that wasn't a disaster, but persistently in ways that accumulated into a reputation for being difficult to plan around. Word spread through the industry, as it always does. Mechanical officers talked to each other at conventions. Operating managers shared experiences. The C415 acquired a reputation as a locomotive that worked but caused headaches. That reputation killed orders more effectively than any actual failure could have. ALCO, already weakened and eventually withdrawing from locomotive production in 1969, couldn't afford a product that sold in dozens rather than hundreds. The C415 remained a footnote, an interesting design that demonstrated how a locomotive can be technically adequate but operationally problematic. The surviving units continued working for years after production ended. Some ran into the 1980s. A few have been preserved. They weren't bad locomotives. They just required more planning discipline than the railroad industry was willing to provide. The ALCO C415 didn't burn too much fuel. That's not what held it back. It burned fuel differently. Under some conditions, it was as economical as anything in its class. Under other conditions, it consumed fuel at rates that surprised everyone. The variation itself was the problem, not the average, not the maximum, but the unpredictability. Railroads can work with locomotives that use more fuel than ideal. They simply factor that into operating costs. What railroads struggle with are locomotives that can't be planned for. When you don't know how much fuel a shift will require, every assignment becomes a calculation wrapped in uncertainty. The C415 illustrates a principle that extends well beyond locomotives. Capability isn't enough. A machine can be powerful, well-built, and fundamentally sound, and still fail commercially because it doesn't fit operational assumptions. The railroad industry had developed its planning methods around locomotives that behaved consistently. The C415 didn't conform, and it paid the price. 26 units built, a production run that lasted barely 2 years. Not a failure in any mechanical sense, just a locomotive that made fuel planning a guessing game. And in an industry that runs on schedules, on predictions, on knowing what tomorrow will require, guessing wasn't good enough.